Hello, I am Jordan, and I am in the midst of a read along of Never Call Retreat by Bruce Catton. It's a read along I'm doing with Steve Donahue, although you might not know that because Steve has not been able to post a video yet due to the what sounds like catastrophic reconstruction going on at his home. I'm told that that is approaching an end, so I believe Steve will be putting up his first video covering about the first half of this book. Oh, okay. Ernie just fell. You alright, bud? He's alright. They bounce. Um, what was I saying? Steve should be putting up his first video um, later this weekend, I'm told. It sounds like his house is recovering. This is going to be my second video covering the second two chapters of the book, which is about the second quarter. And I am thoroughly enjoying it, which I kind of knew I would. I had only previously read a single Catton book, and I loved it. It was This Hallowed Ground. This is a much more in-depth kind of study of the war because it's the third part in a trilogy. I have not read the first two volumes, but so far the book stands alone on its own just fine. These chapters cover a pretty crucial point in the war. It's kind of the tipping point after which the Confederacy could entertain no real legitimate hopes of winning the war. And that's for a couple of reasons, most of them military, of course. The South lost Vicksburg, which means that they lost the Mississippi, which means that the Confederacy was essentially cut in half, and anyone west of the Mississippi was now isolated and totally removed from the materials and the resources, which were, of course, located in Richmond, the Confederate capital. So that was a crushing blow. But these chapters also cover Gettysburg, which is probably justifiably the most famous battle in the war. Catton devotes an entire subchapter to it, and it is, of course, thrilling reading. And Gettysburg is just a highly dramatic moment in American history, of course, but it was also kind of uncharacteristic of the Civil War in a couple ways. First of all, it was the result of a southern invasion northward into Union territory in Pennsylvania, which was relatively rare in the war. The South just didn't have the resources to mount invasions, and they considered themselves fighting a kind of defensive war. But it was a failure. The intent, as I understand it, was to draw attention away from other areas in the war, which was clearly a failure because Vicksburg fell around the same time. Interestingly enough, Lee considered the mission a success despite the crushing defeat at Gettysburg, which I think was probably wishful thinking. The more I'm reading about him, Lee strikes me as a man who was not particularly intelligent. He had an interesting intuitive gift for fighting with inferior numbers, which he was always doing, as the South in general was always doing. And he generally solved that problem by taking massive risks in that he was notorious for splitting his forces, dividing his army, and really disorienting the enemy. He didn't do that at Gettysburg, interestingly enough. He committed to a very traditional, just frontal assault with catastrophic results. So after those two battles, the Confederacy, like I was saying, really had no um, real hopes of winning the war. That pretty much crushed everything. And this was augmented by the fact that it was becoming increasingly clear that the South was not going to be recognized by any foreign powers, especially Britain, which they were really hoping for. There was the idea of King Cotton, that King Cotton would compel foreign nations to recognize the Confederacy. It just didn't pan out for them, thankfully. Which brings me to where I think Catton shines and where I think this war becomes most interesting, which is attitudes at home about the war on both sides. Because while certainly at this point in the war, morale within the Confederacy had never been lower, um, morale in the North was not particularly high either for a number of reasons. Largely because of the way that the war was handled by the Lincoln administration, to be honest. The Lincoln administration was behaving very much like a dictatorship in a number of ways. They were imprisoning people without trial. They were shutting down newspapers with Confederate sympathies, and they had just instituted a draft, and it was a particularly unjust draft because it essentially targeted poor people, right? There was the option to pay your way out. You could pay $300, which at the time was not at all a feasible sum for the lower classes, and you could also hire a substitute to fight in your stead. Again, not an option for poor people. So it was essentially a draft that was aimed at lower class people. And there was pretty violent, catastrophic results, especially in New York City with the famous New York City draft riots, which were just brutal, vicious, gruesome riots, which really developed into race riots. Catton is very eloquent describing the way that as the war became about the emancipation of slaves, it became further removed from what most Northerners were willing to fight for. Us looking back now, or at least me looking back now, the end of slavery is really the only justification that holds any water for the tremendous loss of life that was the Civil War. But at the time, most Northerners thought that they were fighting to preserve the Union, and that remained the rhetoric pretty much right up until the very end. And so as people were being compelled to fight for a cause that was changing and becoming more and more about freeing the slaves, there was some backlash, and it was often quite racially motivated. So during the draft riots, African Americans were targeted, as were members of the upper class. And Catton characteristically really gets at the heart of what that meant for America and for this time period. And I wanted to read you a brief passage describing the draft riots. He writes, the draft riots were based upon ignorance, misery, fear, and the inability of one class of men to understand another class, upon the fact that there really were classes of men in classless American society. The riots loosed war's violence on a city where violence was supposed to be a private matter between the police and the underworld. The rioters had malignant prejudice, and those rioted against had another prejudice equally malignant. If the lynchings and the burnings and the pitched battles in city streets meant anything, they meant that this notion of equality was going to be hard to live with. So that gives you a taste of the way Catton is just so brilliant at getting at the heart of the ideas of the war. And, you know, his descriptions of military events and battles and the movements of armies and the personalities of generals and politicians is, of course, riveting, but I think where he really shines is his kind of broad-stroked, big picture analysis of what was going on in the soul of the country. And I wanted to read you one other passage kind of to demonstrate that, describing, again, Northern attitudes towards the war. Catton describes how there were many moderates in the North, which constituted kind of a peace party, who were under the impression, or perhaps the illusion, Catton argues, that the South would willingly rejoin the Union if the slavery issue was dropped. There was a lot of pushback against the emancipation of the slaves by people other than what were at the time radical Republicans and abolitionists. And so there was this idea that reconciliation was still possible if slavery was dropped, which really ignored the fact that both countries had committed to a war basically of attrition, and the South was not willing to really rejoin under any circumstances. I wanted to read another passage describing that idea. So he writes, conservative men believed it, that is, they believed that the South would accept reconciliation if slavery was dropped, as in the emancipation of slavery was dropped. Conservative men believed it because they had to, for their own peace of mind. The war had changed immeasurably in 2 years. It had finally become what Mr. Lincoln long ago had hoped it would not become, a remorseless revolutionary struggle. And at its revolutionary heart lay precisely this decision to free the slave and so to create a new sort of America. To believe that this decision was all that stood between the old republic and a lasting peace was to do no more than make a profession of faith, the orthodox American faith, sorely beset now by diverse heresies. These conservatives were not in any real sense a peace party. They were simply a party of moderates in a revolutionary situation, faring about as moderates always fare in revolutions, ground pitilessly between two extremes. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how riveting this book is as a read. Catton is truly a remarkable writer. It reads better than most fiction that I've read, but it has the narrative appeal and the character appeal of great fiction. So I hope you guys are joining us. I think some of you perhaps are, and let me know what you're thinking of the book so far. And check out Steve's video as soon as it shows up this weekend. And thanks for watching. Have a good day.